All right, everybody, why don't we get started? Thanks for jumping on today. We really appreciate it. Today's topic is nurse retention. We're going to share some insights from nurses as well as from 700 plus hospitals. And we're really excited to share that information and excited that you've joined us today. We have with us our head of customer success, Sara Sweat. Sara, thanks for jumping on.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So let's do this. Let's do some housekeeping items before we actually jump in. We're going to try to be relatively quick today. We found that 60 to 90-minute webinars kind of lose people at some point. So we're going to try to keep this to 30 minutes or so. But we do encourage you to ask questions. We really want you to ask questions. So just type those into the chat or the Q&A bar at the top of your Zoom panel there, and we'll address those throughout if appropriate or at the end of the discussion as well. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is this is being recorded. You'll have access to the recording, and that'll be a valuable tool for you as well, we hope. So let's talk about the agenda. So we're going to talk about the nurse labor market today, insights into nurse hiring and retention from proprietary data that we have gathered, and then also how Incredible Health can help, and then Q&A as well. So let's talk first of all about the nurse labor market today. We were talking before the call started, Sara, just about how unique this labor market is, how generationally it's unique. But what we're seeing broadly is the demand for healthcare workers keeps increasing, and the number of workers that are going into healthcare has not increased at the same rate. And that causes obviously a shortage, and that's a problem that's getting worse. So we're estimating 1.1 million nurses short of the need by the end of 2023. And then we're also seeing relatively high acute care nurse turnover, which is 18.7% now, which is a big number. And then the one that really shocks me is the 89 days to hire a permanent specialized nurse. That's a long time, and it's gone up pretty dramatically even in just the last 5 years. So Sara, two questions for you. Why do you think that has continued to go up? And why on earth is it 3 months? Like, why? That's a long time. Like, what are the issues here?
It is. It's definitely a long time. For the health systems on our platform, our target is for them to be hiring in less than 20 days. And so I think one of the things that's happening here is just a systemic problem with how we hire. We have a limited number of recruiters. We have a limited number of nurses, and trying to help them connect with each other quickly through what can be more detailed and regimented hiring processes can reduce the likelihood that those nurses actually get hired at that facility. Nurses are tending to go to those systems that are hiring more quickly.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think people think they're improving their process if they take longer. Like, man, our process is so thorough, when in reality, you're probably just turning off qualified candidates.
I think
Go ahead.
I think we see that absolutely. Even just from a dollars and cents perspective, it hurts the health system for it to take this long. Typically, the savings between the hourly rate of a permanent nurse and the hourly rate of a traveler for just the 69-day delta between this average days to hire and our sub 20 days target is enough to fund an entire partnership. So that doesn't even take into account things like vacancy and overtime and staffing ratios that end up leading to burnout for nurses. So the faster you can fill an open role with an experienced permanent nurse, the more likely you protect yourself from the implications of all of the statistics here.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned our time of around 20 days, less than 20 days actually on average, in some markets quite a bit less. But essentially hospitals are using our technology as like a two-way marketplace. Nurses sign up for Incredible Health, and then hospitals are able to go on there, schedule interviews with nurses, and have better matching capabilities and make those hires in less than 20 days. In some markets, we're talking 14, 15 days, right, Sara?
That's right. And what we find is what any experienced recruiter will tell you: speed is your superpower. Not only does speed allow you to shift the ratio of traveler to permanent staff on your floors, but you capitalize on the best talent. Most nurses on our platform are fielding multiple competitive offers. It happens on and off the platform. But what we know from the data is that 61% of them will accept the first offer they get, even if offers 2 and 3 are for greater compensation. So making sure that we're tracking every stage of the hiring funnel and ensuring where we can accelerate hiring and reduce barriers for those nurses in the process is really correlated with the outcomes that our health systems want to see.
That's interesting. All right, let's dive into the data here a little bit. So we have data from hospitals, we have data from nurses, and I should just preview as well. We do a very extensive study every year on with nurses. So this year in 2023 we had 3,100 nurses respond, and we also gathered data from around 500,000 nurses, and we're releasing the new data here in the next couple of weeks. So watch for that. But these are really, I think, important insights from hospitals and nurses that has been gathered over the last year or so. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about turnover and burnout. So 34% of nurses say it's highly likely they'll quit their job by the end of the year. 44% cited burnout and a high stress environment as the primary reason for that, not benefits and pay. That was second, but burnout and high stress were number one. First of all, that surprised me a little. I would have expected pay to be up there, but is that consistent with what you're seeing across our customer base? Is burnout, high stress being an issue for nurses?
Absolutely. I talk with health system leaders every day, and one of the most common things that I say is that the reality is your greatest competition is not another health system. Your greatest competition is nurses exiting the profession altogether. And we see that continuing to happen and impact the quality of care across the country. I actually just spoke with an ED nurse the other day, 22 years of experience in the ED, but he said he's had to switch specialties and now works in pediatrics at a different hospital because working in the ED where he was, there was so much maltreatment, violence happening in the ED that he's found, especially after the pandemic, he's just lost his ability to have empathy for adults. So as hard as it is to work with sick kiddos, he's able to at least have empathy for them because he's not being verbally and physically assaulted in that setting.
Wow, that's really interesting. So he got so fed up with adults and the stress and the things that come with that he said, man, I'm going to try to go to a pediatric unit. That's really really interesting. And we'll continue this here. Like top reasons nurses are leaving jobs. Career advancement is a big one. They need to see a path to moving up or moving around in some way. I think we were talking about this before the call, Sarah, but the days of like a nurse having the same job in the same facility for 30 years and doing the same thing, like those are over. And I shouldn't even use 30 years. I might need to use 40 years. Like it's totally changed.
Like all industries, right?
Yeah,
We
yeah.
just don't see that trend as much, and it certainly applies to nurses. I think when I look at these top reasons why nurses leave jobs, we'll go into each of them a little bit more specifically in the future slides, but I think what I see when I look at those is that there's so much resilience in this nurse population. Despite everything, despite the challenges of the role, they want to do the job and they're trying to make the vital work that they do fit into the construct of their life and what they need in terms of their career.
And then flexible schedules, I think, is really an interesting one because that is to varying degrees possible and not possible. What are hospitals doing to try to meet that need, that desire for some flexibility?
Yeah, I think self-scheduling is really important. We'll talk about in just a minute kind of some additional stats about self-scheduling that are important to nurses, but just having the flexibility to offer a variety of schedules is really important.
It's great. All right, so why are nurses leaving? And what can you actually do to stop that? So let's talk through this a little bit. Career advancement, things like cross-training, coordinator roles for aspiring leaders, programming specialties and leadership training, and then flexible scheduling, shift options. I love the idea of the float pool. Are there any things on this list that you want to highlight, Sarah?
Yeah, I think when we see career advancement, what nurses are really saying is that they want an employer who's just as invested in them and their career growth as they are in that health system. So things like cross-training programs and true documented career mobility plans allow them to grow their career in the same place without having to shift employers in order to get the experience they want to get to grow their careers. With the flexible schedules, and given the high rate of retirement in the wake of the pandemic, the average age of an experienced nurse is just lower than it was 10 years ago. Their schedules are different. Many of them have school-age children, and so they're struggling with the traditional scheduling models that have always been a part of nursing. And as an industry, we're having to evolve. So they're looking for flexibility in their schedule. And just in reality, for a health system, that makes covering the needs of a floor harder, right? Self-scheduling, flexible schedules, offering multiple shift options, float pools, internal travel nurses. There's a lot of complexity in that. But what it's doing is giving nurses more control over their schedule. And that's what this generation of nurses needs most.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Like, these things are great for retention, they're great for job satisfaction, but they actually do make it more challenging to cover the needs of the floor. And as leaders, that's something that everyone needs to recognize. So that's a really good point. Like, this sounds all great, but it does make certain things more challenging, and we should be really honest about that. And then, why do nurses leave, and what can you do about that? So reduce commute time or relocation, and then compensation. And compensation, of course, is the one that everybody goes back to, but it's also sometimes the hardest one to move. Anything you want to highlight from these two categories, Sarah?
Yeah, I think the both of these are not surprising, right? No one, regardless of their career, wants to feel like they're not making a fair wage and that they have to have an untenable commute. For those health systems that are using our platform, our algorithm identifies the commute time for the nurse. And so includes that in our match criteria to help eliminate that potential barrier. But the health systems that I've seen be most successful on our platform are really welcoming nurses to come in from out of state and offering pretty robust relocation benefits to assist them in making the move. And from that compensation perspective, I think, as long as you're at or above that 50th percentile and you have really strong competitive shift differentials for nights and weekends, this one doesn't end up being as much of a barrier. But things like internal equity and allowing them to have options in terms of what their benefits look like can make a big difference, because compensation, we're finding, isn't just about money. It's about kind of multifaceted benefit programs that attract talent and allows for everyone to be operating at the top of their license.
That's a really good point. It's not just about the direct salary. There's all sorts of things that people look at when they consider their compensation. So I think that's a great point. All right, let's talk about experience here. One of the biggest challenges is if you have constant high turnover, it's really hard to get a tenured team, and it's really hard to get any continuity on that team. And then turnover, especially if it's consistent, can be really expensive. The one that surprised me on this list is just the cost of the turnover for an RN. Like, that's a big number, that $46,000. Why is that so high? And is there anything else here you want to highlight?
Yeah, that is absolutely a high number, but it's the average. There are places where it costs as much as $92,000 for turnover for a specialized nurse. And it's really actually only increased over the last year. Most of the turnover that we see is coming from nurses with less than 2 years experience. So that's what's going to contribute most to the turnover that's happening on the floor. If we look at nurses who have at least 5 years of experience, they're only contributing to about 14% of the turnover that happens on a floor. And that's why we specialize in experienced permanent nurses, because the average age of experience on our platform is about 8 to 10 years, which means you're not actually just saving by removing a traveler with a permanent nurse, but you're also saving in years 2 and 3 because they're much more likely to stay.
Interesting. Really interesting. So this slide I love because it highlights what's really important to nurses during that process. what do you see from, and I'm guessing this has changed, like only 25% of nurses stated they would be unlikely to complete an application. That's actually a fairly high number, I think. And then you're doing phone screens, talking about updated resumes. What do you want to highlight from this slide, Sarah?
I think what's important here is that a full quarter of nurses who responded said they'd be unlikely to complete that application prior to speaking with a hiring manager. So not allowing this to be a barrier to the hiring manager conversation can increase your talent pool quickly. That's 25% of nurses who said they weren't likely to do it. We find throughout the funnel that any artificial barrier at the front of the funnel, where while there's usually a good administrative reason behind it, it creates drop off from the hiring funnel. And things like resumes work very similarly. They take time for a nurse to update. And so they really want to have an opportunity to learn about the opportunity with the health system before they invest the time to update that resume. We find that not allowing this to be a barrier to speaking with the hiring manager can also really quickly impact the talent pool.
So you're saying do that meeting first before you make them go through that extra effort. Otherwise, it creates an unnecessary barrier.
With applications and resumes, I would say our recommendation is always to put those as late in your hiring funnel as you can. At the bare minimum, never allow scheduling the hiring manager interview to be dependent on an updated resume or application. If you need to have it in before that happens, then generally nurses can make that work. But we see a lot of drop off in health systems that require resumes and applications prior to scheduling that hiring manager interview.
Interesting. Really interesting. And then flexible scheduling, they're looking for these sorts of things in the next role. I love how specific you're being with this. The cross training one's interesting, which leads me to believe that 90% say cross training is important, right? What sort of programs have you seen hospitals employ there? Is it formal? Is it informal shadowing? Like, what sort of things are hospitals doing to meet that cross training demand specifically?
Yeah, it's both formal and informal. I'll tell you, the formal cross training programs that fit in that kind of documented career progression planning make the biggest impact. It's really about investment. If I believe that I can grow my career here, not only does that allow me to stay at the facility and see my career trajectory at that health system, but it also prevents burnout, because there's nothing that helps that burnout more than inspiration, learning something new, being excited about something different. So when they can feel that career change is possible, we have more opportunity to keep them engaged in the process. And so we recommend that recruiters speak about cross training if that's something that's offered for a subset of specialties or for the health system overall. Talk about it early and often in the recruiting process, because it makes a big difference to nurses.
Awesome. That's great. And then this one I love as well. What's continuing the theme of what's important, flexibility and for the interview itself. That's an interesting thing that is probably kind of a post-COVID reality, is you have to be willing to be flexible during the process, which I think is vital. And then the references one is really interesting to me. So that seems to be a pretty dramatic shift in the way recruiters and hiring managers are thinking about things. Is that fair?
I think so. I think a lot of these are new dynamics in the hiring process that our most successful health systems are already navigating. They're already kind of on the other side of it. With that hiring manager flexibility, I think there's this perception that if a person interviews in person or they have a shadow day, that somehow increases retention, but that's just simply not what the data say. And we find that nurses are 70% of nurses that we surveyed said they were unlikely to move forward with the organization if they required the completion of multiple references before extending an offer. And that before is what's really important here. They want the offers quickly. and they're fine with making an offer contingent upon successful completion of references. But the days that get added to that hiring funnel, when we allow those references to be a barrier to offer extension, usually another health system is coming in and snagging up that talent in the meantime.
It is the time on that last bullet point is absolutely crazy, isn't it? Like 7% of nurses say that they would wait more than a week, which 93% won't wait more than a week. It's just, you know, what's funny too is I think just human nature is people forget if they're excited about a role,
Yeah.
they kind of forget how excited they were if half a month goes on, right? Like it's probably going to decrease your likelihood of them actually joining. So I love that piece of data there. That's a really interesting one. Let me ask you one final question that isn't on a slide, but it's just kind of a macro question. What would you say to those who say, look, this is all great, but we have a certain way of doing things at our hospital, and it doesn't match some of these things. And it's just really a bear to change a lot of this. That's something we run into sometimes with the hospitals we work with. What would you say to that leader that just says, look, this is a lot, and this is, you know, this post-COVID craziness will stop and we'll get back to the way we've always done things?
Yeah, I would say that data is key, right? If you're a health system that doesn't have any nurse openings, then you have the luxury of not evaluating the options for what might help hire faster. But I don't know any of those health systems. So I think the important thing here, and what I always try to do with our clients, is provide the data that we have. We have this really unique vantage point as a health system, and it allows us to gather data differently, than our health systems are able to do for themselves. And so sharing the data sometimes helps overcome internal resistance, when you can actually see the missed opportunity in your personal funnel of the nurses who we lost because we weren't following the sort of recommended best practices that many of our health systems across the nation are doing.
Love it. Okay, cool. Let's talk about how Incredible Health can help, and then we'll take your questions. So we mentioned trusted by about 700 health systems, over that, to hire permanent nurses in under 20 days. We're not a staffing agency. We don't do travel nurses. It's really about matching these medical centers, these health systems, with the nurses that meet their needs, and trying to do that as quickly as possible. Why do nurses sign up for the platform? Well, access to all these hospitals who may be looking for them, but also continuing education, salary estimators, a lot of really cool and free tools. We have, I think, 700 and some odd thousand on the system right now, Sarah, that are signed up. That's almost a quarter of the acute care nurses in the country. So it's a really big number. And then the way it works, employers apply to candidates instead of the other way around, which means nurses love it. It's a seamless, quick, simple process for them. And then we're able to match the nurses that you need with the roles you have. And that's a valuable and important thing as well. So, and you can see the speed here. Like if this client was doing it in 66 days, we did it for them in 19 days. So it's just a much simpler process. And you get to talk to these hospitals all the time and hear how simple it might be for them, and what they're used to. Anything you want to add about the process that isn't reflected in these slides, Sarah?
No, I think you covered it really well. That speed is your superpower. And not only does it allow you to hire faster, but when you have more permanent experienced nurses on your floor, it impacts retention as well.
All right, let's talk about this Q&A here. So I'll read through these, Sarah, and we can address them as we go. So let me just sort through these. You guys we really only work with acute care hospitals at this time. Do we anticipate changing that anytime? So we get this question on every webinar. What types of facilities do we work with, and what are the parameters around those facilities, Sarah?
Yeah, so today we work with acute care facilities across the United States. I think a significant portion of our roadmap as an organization comes from our clients, from what they define as their market need. And so I am confident that there are opportunities for expansion into other care sites and specialties in the future. But right now, we're really focused on this most, significant need in the market, which is nurses that are working in acute care facilities.
Great answer. All right, Dave asks, he says, hi, thanks for doing the webinar. Referring to the 89 days of hire, do we have a breakdown of that for new grads versus experienced, either with or without Incredible Health? In other words, does it typically take less time or more time to hire new grads? And do we see a difference when people use Incredible Health with that same question as well?
Yeah, that's a good call out. The data that quoted 89 days was actually the US Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and it didn't include a breakout between experienced nurses versus new hires. It just averaged all permanent specialized nurses.
Love it. Okay. Yeah, Carla just points out oncology is a field where a lot of nurses don't want to stay. They've seen major turnover.
Yeah, we see
obvious reasons. That's a tough.
It is. We see step down telemetry, ED having some really high turnover rates, women's health, pediatrics having lower turnover rates, but oncology is a tough one too.
Yeah, and then someone's asking as well about data around the nurse survey itself. And as I said, this year, it's about well over 3,000 nurses that responded to it. And then we also gathered and pulled data from over 400,000 nurses that are on the system. As we mentioned, we have 700,000, more than 700,000 total. But we gathered a lot of anonymous data and then also sent out the survey. Pamela's asking, are nurse managers and director level positions included in the platform?
They are, absolutely. Great. We work with health systems to hire nurse leaders all the time.
Love it. And then final question here, have we found that compensation is more of a focus or less of a focus today than before? It seems like the stress and the burnout has actually superseded compensation, but how would you approach that question?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely a factor. We see stress and burnout being the highest rate for turnover, the highest reason for turnover, but compensation is, and especially by market. In some markets, that ends up being the greatest driver. And so it's important to not only be competitive with your compensation, but to offer that really diverse, multifaceted benefits option so that they can see not only the compensation, but the investment from the organization in their growth and well-being. Great.
Awesome, Sarah. Well, thank you for jumping on and taking the time. I know you're busy taking care of the 700 plus hospitals that we work with. So thank you for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. Any final thoughts for everybody before we jump off?
No, I think I would just say thank you. Honestly, we work with health systems from across the country, and what I can tell you is the chief nursing officers and chief HR officers and their teams are tired, right? They have been fighting this battle for a long time, but they continue to be resilient and continue to be creative about the way that they are attracting and retaining nursing staff. So I'm just grateful that I get to work with a group of really innovative and smart people every day in our health systems.
That's great. Well, thanks for jumping on, everybody. We tried to, we didn't lie. We said a half hour and here we are. So thanks for jumping on. I know we were right on time. Thanks for jumping on though, everybody. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy. We hope this was valuable, and please watch for the new nursing study that will be out here in the next 2 weeks. So thanks again. Have a fantastic day and a great rest of the week. Bye, everybody.